In today's video, we're back discussing updates from Aquestive Therapeutics, who are advancing medicines to solve therapeutic problems and thereby improving lives. Looking at their press releases, on June 15, they have released initial top-line data from the Part 3 of their ongoing Epiphast clinical trial, which is evaluating their compound AQST, or their formulation I should say, AQST-109, which is an epinephrine oral film. Now, if you have seen any of my previous videos on Aquestive Therapeutics, you may recall, otherwise this is perhaps new information for you, Aquestive Therapeutics, their core technology is really in their ability to reformulate existing drugs, and epinephrine is definitely not a new drug. It is used to treat anaphylactic shock, a quite severe, potentially life-threatening situation. And they are working in their clinical program on an oral film and thereby a much more user-friendly delivery method of epinephrine in case it needs to be taken in an emergency. Although I have a PhD in biomedical engineering and over 17 years of working experience in the healthcare industry, I do not intend to give you investment advice. Please consider your own risk profile before making any investments and research your investments wisely. We'll take a look at the setup of this part 3 of the Epiphast clinical trial, and actually I tried to visualize the different arms that are part of the Epiphast clinical trial. Now, this top-line data is basically from part 3. The parts 1 and 2 have already been completed, and we'll take a look at exactly what they were trying to achieve with this particular study. For and foremost, of course, epinephrine, as I had mentioned, is a quite well-known drug that's been used for many, many years. And the most prevalent form of delivery of epinephrine is with the so-called epipen. The AQST-109 formulation of epinephrine is, well, an oral film, and more precise, it is a sublingual film. That means that patients should take it, basically putting this film under the tongue, from where it will then dissolve and is absorbed into the bloodstream, and therefore, well, reaching the necessary concentration for the drug actually to combat the symptoms of anaphylactic shock. For and foremost, in these kinds of clinical trials, it is extremely important to establish the pharmacodynamics and the pharmacokinetics. It is basically the speed of absorption, distribution, what concentrations over which durations can be achieved using a particular formulation, and that, of course, in comparison to what pretty much is the gold standard, something like the EpiPen, which is an intramuscular injection of epinephrine for emergency use situations. As clearly stated by the company, the purpose of this part 3 of Epiphast was to continue the study on administration of this oral film under a variety of different conditions. And these are ultimately the 3 different arms from which they are reporting top-line data right now, and there are 2 additional remaining arms that yet have to be actually carried out in terms of conducting the clinical study. So let me try and illustrate a little bit more what these different arms actually were and what the results are. So all the different arms that are part of the Part 3 Epiphast trial use a concentration of 12 milligram in the oral film of epinephrine. Now, the first arm is basically testing the pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics, as well as the safety profile under the ideal conditions. And those are that the oral film is held 4 minutes under the tongue. That's the target duration. And of course, since we know that in real life, especially emergency situations, never or hardly ever the ideal conditions are actually happening in the real world. This is why the additional 2 arms test shorter durations of the oral film under the tongue. So in the second arm, instead of 4 minutes, the oral film remained only 2 minutes under the tongue and probably, well, then was swallowed. And the last situation is probably the worst in terms of the drug absorption, because the oral film actually does not remain under the tongue, it is actually immediately swallowed. Then there are two additional arms for which patient data actually still has to be collected. And those two additional arms are dosing or taking the oral epinephrine film 2 minutes after eating a peanut butter sandwich, and swallowing it again immediately with 240 milliliters of water. As a quick side note, you may be wondering what's the significance about peanut butter sandwiches. Well, you probably are very familiar with the fact that peanut butter can be very sticky and viscous. Additionally, peanut butter is very greasy, and an oral film which is supposed to dissolve under the tongue under the influence of water would definitely have some issues with a rather oil-based substance sticking somewhere to the mouth. In this sense, the peanut butter sandwich is a worst-case example of a diffusion barrier that could potentially hinder, or at least to some point impact, how quickly the oral film can dissolve and how quickly the epinephrine can diffuse into the bloodstream. So the peanut butter sandwich arm is an example of somewhat a simulated worst case, but a realistic real-life case that could definitely happen, trying to see how is the absorption of epinephrine impacted by certain types of food that we eat. Here's the data Aquestive have obtained as part 3 of the Epiphast trial. We can clearly see here that the baseline adjusted concentration of epinephrine in the blood in picograms per milliliter is the highest in the ideal situation, which is holding the oral film 4 minutes under the tongue. However, even reducing that time to 2 minutes reduces the peak concentration only very minimally, from just under 600 down to 550 picogram per milliliter. And if the oral film is swallowed immediately, the peak concentration is just a little bit above 300 picogram per milliliter. Though all of these values are far above the presumed threshold, which is 100 picograms per milliliter, in order for epinephrine to take effect. Of course, also for an emergency drug, the duration within which the peak concentration is reached is of utmost importance. And in this graph, we can't really quite appreciate how much faster the oral film is in comparison to the current gold standard, which is the intramuscular injection via the EpiPen. So let's take a look at the chart that Aquestive Therapeutics have included in their press release. So that data, the time for the concentration Tmax to be reached is actually quite consistent and very strongly in the favor of the oral film by Aquestive Therapeutics. That time is 12 minutes for the ideal case, holding the film under the tongue for 4 minutes, and then 15 minutes, only 3 minutes longer actually in the less ideal cases. And that compares to 50 minutes for the current gold standard to reach the Tmax concentration in the blood, which is roughly 4 times longer than for the epinephrine oral film. These are all very promising data, and in my mind leave no doubt that Aquestive Therapeutics are on the right path in order to get this oral film through the FDA, following of course the phase 3 study. Now, some additional timelines here. So the end of phase 2 meeting with the FDA, they anticipate to be in Q4 of 2022. And the remaining data from the 2 additional arms of the part 3 study, mainly peanut butter sandwich and swallowing the film with water, we can expect in Q3 of 2022. Of course, there's no denying that the stock price has continued to come down with the overall market. But Aquestive Therapeutics serves as an excellent example that illustrates that all healthcare companies continue to innovate and drive their clinical programs forward, thereby reducing investor risk actually and creating value at the same time. So Aquestive Therapeutics actually has become an even more interesting investment right now, as it is available at a cheaper price, and we have even more positive data from the epinephrine clinical program. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video, and if you haven't done so, subscribing to my channel.